Thanks, Tom. You guys should be sick of me by the time this is all done. Again, I need to acknowledge the other folks that that make this project possible. Without the efforts of everybody involved and the agencies that we represent, this type of work would not be possible. So, with this talk, I'm going to be updating you folks on where we stand with our spawning Cisco surveys in Wisconsin waters. We initiated a project, not this last fall, but the fall previous, the fall of 2013. And suffice it to say, those results generated a fair amount of discussion. And so we replicated that effort again this fall, and that's what I'll be reporting on here today. So again, I'm not going to get into a whole lot of detail, but I will say that Cisco are really the centerpiece of the fish community in Lake Superior and serve as a vital energy link between lower trophic levels and higher trophic levels. Lejeune, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, is the roe of Vendus, and it is quite popular in Scandinavian countries. However, the decline of Vendus in the Baltic Sea resulted in increased demand for that product. When they couldn't find it, they looked for a suitable surrogate, and they found that with the roe of Cisco or herring. And so when that happened, the demand for Cisco roe soared. This is a graph in which yield is on the y-axis, and each of the management jurisdictions are lumped together, with each of the bars representing harvest between 2006 and 2013. The black horizontal bars represent the average harvest between 1990 and 2005. And what this graph shows is that really it was Wisconsin that was able to respond to that increased demand for Cisco. And that is due to the fact that the commercial fleet in Wisconsin is very large, and the regulations in Wisconsin are essentially lacking. Whereas in Minnesota and Ontario, they actively manage those stocks, and thus those harvests have been relatively stable through time. When we focus into Wisconsin waters, what you can see is that effort was relatively stable from 2000 onward. However, increased effort in response to market demands resulted in essentially an exponential increase in total effort. And that total effort translated into what was essentially an exponential increase in harvest, with the exception of 2013 harvest came back down. And those trends are entirely driven by the market. Where we stand today is the levels of harvest that we're seeing now are directly related to the levels of harvest that collapsed the stocks in the middle of the last century. This rapid increase in harvest was facilitated by the fact that commercial processors began accepting fish in the round in the year 2008. What I mean by that is commercial fishers no longer had to dress fish or cut the fish open, and instead they could take that time and focus more effort or focus more time on setting and retrieving nets. Luckily, the Lake Superior Technical Committee has dedicated considerable resources to understanding these species in Lake Superior, as it's not only an important species for Lake Superior, but it's also important for restoration efforts in the lower Great Lakes. In this paper by Dan Yule, what he showed is that the average densities of spawning Cisco along Wisconsin's south shore are truly remarkable in the fall months. what he showed is that in October, there's very few, if any, fish along the south shore outside of Cornucopia. But once you get into November, you see densities that are quite remarkable, with average densities approximately 450 fish per hectare and maximum densities, upwards of 900 fish per hectare. I know guys that work in inland lakes that are tickled pink when they can have 5 walleye per acre, so it really kind of puts it in perspective. Jason Stockwell and other members of the Lake Superior Technical Committee wrote a synthesis of our understanding of Cisco in Lake Superior. And what they described in there was quite timely, and they suggested that despite low levels of harvest at the time that this paper was drafted, they warned managers that Cisco are vulnerable to overfishing due to the fact that they are very long-lived and their recruitment is quite intermittent. And also the nature of the commercial fishery which targets these stocks, and that commercial fishery targets the spawning aggregations. Jason also explored the idea of what a reasonable control rule might be, and they settled on the fact that 10 to 15% of large females would likely be sustainable. However, it should be noted that control rule has not undergone a management strategy evaluation. Alongside this growth in fishery effort, fishery managers have had a concern about the recruitment of these fishes. The 1984 year class is really what spurred the recovery of these stocks in Lake Superior. But since that time, we've seen the magnitude of recruitment dampened and the frequency of recruitment events become longer and longer spaced apart. This is results of the USGS Spring Bottom Trawl Survey, and it serves as a nice index, a very nice index of Cisco recruitment. And what we can see is that these large year classes are at this point really gone, and it's the 1998, 03, and 09 year class that are supporting the fishery today. And this 09 year class is making up a large portion of the commercial harvest. Given our concerns about the growth in the fishery, along with the lack of recruitment, we designed a collaborative study which brought together multiple agencies to assess Cisco populations in Wisconsin waters in and around the Apostle Islands. In 2013, we set out to sample outside of Cornucopia, and then we had planned to sample north of Sand Island, and then in the third year, east of Madeline Island. However, that plan did change. So our objective going into this year was to repeat last year's sampling efforts in grids 1306 and 07 because of the results that we had from that effort. And we had planned to go forward with our sampling efforts in grids 1208 and 1209 just north of Sand Island. However, the lake had other ideas. We had a series of challenges to our efforts in 2014, the first being the fact that there's critical equipment failure on board the research vessel Kaya while it was docked down in Cleveland, and that really took that vessel out of the picture. We also had a very cold fall and early ice conditions that really took out other vessels that we may have been able to use. So what we were left with is trying to use our own gillnet tug, it's kind of a tank, and it did a perfect job for what we needed to do. However, we didn't know how to deploy the acoustic transducer from this tug, and we didn't know how it would, how well that system would operate on board a fairly noisy gillnet tug assessment boat. We were lucky enough that Mark Ebner provided us with a bracket that had worked on one of their vessels, and it worked absolutely beautifully on our boat. the acoustic data that we collected on the night of December 6th was very clean, and it worked incredibly well. The one caveat with this pole mount system that you see here is that we needed very calm conditions in order to execute that sampling effort. Last November was anything but calm, so we were really left onshore waiting for conditions in which we could get out to do our sampling. And then there's a massive migration of Wisconsinites in November out into the woods, and so we were left without a crew. And despite my begging and pleading, they did not care what I said. They were not going to give up on deer season. And so this whole effort was pushed into December. This is a graph of weather station observations at Devil's Island, and it really kind of shows what I just said in the previous graph, that temperatures plummeted in November and were well below zero for most of that month, which really froze up a lot of the access points. And then winds were mostly above 15 knots for the month, with the exception of deer season, where it was nice and calm while we were up in our tree stands. So we finally got out on December 6th, and we had a gorgeous night, and we did what we could. However, it should be noted that given all these complications, what we were left with was only retrieving acoustic data, and we did not have any fish samples to go with that. We used the 2013 samples to apportion our acoustic targets, and we have reason to believe that will provide reasonable estimates. So this is a plot of, remember in 2006, Dan saw estimates of upwards of 450 fish per hectare. Last fall, in the middle of November, we saw 58 fish per hectare, which is really what got this conversation started. On December 6th, we saw density estimates of 167 fish per hectare, which is an increase, but you need to temper your expectations until the end of the talk to really kind of put that into perspective. So when we look at our estimates of abundance of spawning females in grid 1307, we were at very high levels of abundance. And in these last two sampling events, we've come down quite a bit. Although 2014 is an increase from 2013. Again, we'll kind of get into why those estimates may be tenuous. Meanwhile, total harvest in grid 1307 has been on somewhat of a decline. And this is the result of really the market. Fishing hasn't started until the month of November, strictly due to the fact that commercial buyers haven't purchased the fish until that time. However, when we dig into some of the dynamics of the fishery, it's actually somewhat worrisome. While total harvest has gone down over that time, in November, total effort is still ramping up. Still, to the commercial fishermen, they're seeing fairly steady CPEs, which is here in kilograms per kilometer. And these 1,000 kilograms per kilometer are quite high. So to a commercial fisherman, they're still seeing a lot of fish come on their boats, which is what you would expect when you're fishing a spawning aggregation. What's quite worrisome is that when you look at the month of December, although at this time biomass is low and effort is relatively low, the CPEs in the month of December nearly triple. And when I've looked back at the records, there's some situations where a 1,500-foot net has caught nearly 5,000 pounds of fish. So in the month of December, it seems that for some reason these fish are becoming increasingly vulnerable to commercial pressure. when we take our abundance estimates and compare that to the harvest, what we see is that we were really at a level that was what would be deemed safe under the guidance of the Lake Superior Tech Committee, which says that 10 to 15% mortality on spawning females is likely sustainable. Last year's estimate was really kind of made us think where we are at with our Cisco management, or lack thereof. And the 2014 estimate, although it has come down from what 2013 was, is still exceeding what we would deem sustainable. So as with any sampling effort, there's caveats. And our sampling effort focused on waters outside of cornucopia, which we know to be some of the most important waters for Cisco spawning. However, in Dan's 2009 paper, he showed that spawning Cisco aggregate along the entire South Shore. So future sampling events, as we explore some of these different areas, will really show whether we're seeing a localized signal of fishing pressure, or if this issue is really pervasive throughout the entire South Shore and in the Apostle Islands. Another thing we've gotten in the habit of doing is comparing the timing of our surveys to the commercial CPE that occurs for operators at that time. So in this 2008 paper, what Dan showed is that the timing of the survey, indicated here by the gray shaded bars, coincides with when commercial CPE was essentially flat. And notice that right here they're harvesting about 1,000 kilograms per kilometer as well. When we look at what happened in 2013 and 2014, in 2013, our sampling occurred on approximately November 13, 14, 15, between these dashed lines here. Fish were definitely aggregated and available for sampling, but this really caused concern of what is happening here in the month of December, where all of a sudden there appears to be this influx of fish. When we look at our 2014 sampling, it happened on December 6th, and it appears to have occurred at a time when commercial CPE was, again, extremely high. So it makes us wonder if maybe we actually sampled at a time when either there was more fish or those fish were more vulnerable to sampling. We're really not sure what's happening here with the dynamics of, the movement dynamics of fish during this critical period. It goes without saying that we know what happens when we don't pay attention to some of these trends. In 1982, James Selgeby published a paper in which he highlighted how Cisco stocks in Wisconsin waters were depleted and essentially collapsed. And this collapse happened in a very short period of time, in a span of 2 to 3 years. Commercial fishers are able to maintain a very high CPE until essentially the bottom falls out of the fishery, and the CPE drops to very low levels in a short period. When he looks at individual ports, the story is still the same. This CPE can drop in the span of 2 to 3 years quite quickly, so I think we need to pay very close attention to what is happening here. It begs the question of, given the dynamics in the Wisconsin commercial fishery compared to what is happening in Minnesota and Ontario, we don't regulate, or we have very little regulation for Wisconsin commercial fishers, whereas Minnesota has adopted a control rule in which they have agreed that 10% of the lower 95% confidence interval of fish 305 millimeters or greater is what they will allow for harvest. I simply used our estimates for fish greater than 250, and I came up with the limit for grid 1307 of 76.5 metric tons. However, Wisconsin harvest was 171 metric tons, so we would be exceeding what Minnesota would deem sustainable. In Ontario, they advocated for a 10% of spawner biomass, defined as those fish greater than 250 millimeters. Their limit would be 107 metric tons, which is still lower than what's harvested in Wisconsin waters. So to kind of wrap things up here, one, the spring bottom trout survey conducted by the USGS suggests that another failed year class occurred. Our harvest rates continue to be high and are very likely exceeding what's deemed sustainable. This observed decline is consistent with the lack of recruitment and also a high commercial pressure. And finally, obviously we plan to continue our sampling effort in these waters, and hopefully we don't have the type of fall we did last year. With that, I'll take any quick questions.